I've learned in my 52 years that silence can be louder than any roar, especially when it follows the crackle of a radio announcing your son as a suspect. The day I found myself racing down the linoleum halls of Westfield International, the scent of burnt coffee and stale jet fuel thick in the air, my mind kept circling one question: how did it come to this? How could a place meant to symbolize freedom in the skies become the cage that tried to crush my boy? Isaiah, my bright-eyed aviation-obsessed son, was supposed to be waiting for his tour guide in the pilot's lounge. I'd watched him leave that morning with his ID badge clipped neatly to his shirt, his hands trembling from excitement. But as my phone buzzed violently against my hip with messages from airport security, each word spelling out a nightmare, I felt my gut twist with a cold, familiar fear I hadn't tasted since my earliest days fighting to prove myself in this industry. Would anyone believe a black boy could belong in that lounge? The words of the dispatcher echoed in my head. Unauthorized intruder possibly carrying a fake badge. That phrase stung worse than the scent of scorched rubber drifting from a taxiing plane. I pushed open the staff entrance, my palms slipping on the steel handles slick with humidity. The scent inside was worse, a suffocating blend of cheap cologne, burnt toast, and the sharp, sterile tang of industrial cleaner that always reminded me of the underbelly of the aviation world. I moved quickly, passing knots of staff who parted silently, eyes darting to the FAA pin on my lapel. It wasn't authority they saw in me, it was something closer to fear. Yet a voice gnawed inside. Was it fear of my title or fear of a black man charging through their halls? I arrived at the pilot's lounge door just as Captain Margaret Stone's sharp voice carried through the air, each word slicing like broken glass. He doesn't belong here. Look at him, he can't possibly be authorized. Her tone reeked of certainty of someone used to their word becoming truth. But I knew the truth better than anyone. Isaiah had earned his place here, more than some who wore those 4 gold stripes on their shoulders. Isaiah stood cornered near the back of the room, the muted whir of the air conditioning rattling overhead. His hands were shaking, his eyes wide but determined. His badge, the one Cynthia Lopez from HR had personally handed him, hung torn from his neck like a broken promise. My heart clenched at the sight. The memory of teaching him to fold paper airplanes, of tracing the lines of a Boeing 777 together, crashed over me. Captain Stone held up Isaiah's badge like a trophy. Her face twisted into a sneer so subtle, only those who'd been on the receiving end of such hatred could recognize it. Around them, pilots and staff gathered like wolves drawn by blood whispers thickening the air. Spy. Fake. What's he doing here? A hot rage boiled up my spine, but as I stepped forward, I forced myself to breathe. I'd spent decades in this industry preaching composure, respect, and integrity. Now every life lesson I'd ever taught Isaiah was about to be tested. My footsteps echoed like gunshots in the sudden hush as I crossed the lounge, the thin carpet muffling only part of my fury. Would anyone speak up for him? Would anyone dare? Isaiah spotted me. Then his eyes filling with something that broke me, a fragile, desperate hope. I put a hand on his shoulder, feeling his trembling muscles beneath his thin jacket. He was 16, but right then he looked both older than his years and as young as he'd been when he first gazed up at the sky and declared he'd fly one day. Captain Stone didn't back down. She lifted her chin, her mouth a hard line, her voice dripping with authority as she gestured to Isaiah. He's a threat. He entered a secure area under false pretenses. Her words rang with a practiced cadence, the kind designed to leave no room for doubt. But every syllable made the blood in my ears pound louder. I scanned the crowd, faces, pale eyes averted. Some angry, some intrigued, none brave enough to challenge Stone's accusations. My heart thundered beneath the starched collar of my uniform shirt, sweat trickling down my back despite the chill of the air conditioning. And there it was, the question that had kept me awake nights during Isaiah's childhood. Would the world allow my son to dream? Or would it destroy him first? The tension in the lounge thickened with each passing breath. I squeezed Isaiah's shoulder again, steadying us both. I took a step toward Captain Stone, my voice low but carrying to every corner of the room, filled with the quiet steel I'd honed through years of crises. And what evidence do you have, Captain Stone? Before she could answer, I caught the faintest scent of lavender and stale donuts drifting from a nearby break room, absurdly vivid in the moment. It reminded me of early mornings in air traffic towers, nights spent watching storm systems dance across radar screens. A lifetime of sacrifices, and now all of it balanced on this single confrontation. Would they believe the truth, or had prejudice already written the ending to my son's story? If you're hearing this now, I need you to stay with me. Like, subscribe, or leave a comment if you've ever watched a dream nearly torn apart by ignorance. Because what happened next would change everything we thought we knew about justice in the skies. A stunned silence followed my question, the kind that made each ticking second feel like a hammer striking my eardrums. Captain Margaret Stone's lips parted, but for a breathless moment, nothing came out. The hush in the lounge deepened until even the soft whir of the vending machine in the corner sounded like a roar in my ears. The smell of burned popcorn drifted in from somewhere down the hall, acrid and sharp, making me wonder absurdly if it was someone's lunch burning while they gathered here to watch my son's humiliation. I could see it written in their eyes, discomfort, suspicion, but worst of all, indifference. Some looked down, shifting their feet like children caught misbehaving. Others stared straight ahead, as though if they didn't blink, they wouldn't have to confront the ugly truth unraveling before them. I wondered, did any of them remember what it felt like to dream so fiercely you could barely sleep? Could they recall the first time they fell in love, with flying, the rush of liftoff, the quiet hum of engines above the clouds? Or had the years in uniforms hardened them into people who saw a black boy in a pilot's lounge and decided he was a threat? Stone finally found her voice brittle and sharp. He was unaccompanied in a restricted area. His badge appeared suspicious. Her eyes flicked to the gathered staff searching for agreement. Some nodded more out of habit than conviction. My pulse thudded in my neck, hot and relentless. Isaiah shifted beside me. I felt the tremor run through him like a current. His eyes, the same deep brown as his mother's, glistened with held-back tears, but his chin was lifted in quiet defiance. I'd seen that look when he was 8 and crashed his model glider only to spend a week fixing it piece by painstaking piece. It was the same determination that made him practice flight simulator landings until midnight, long after I told him to get some rest. I drew a breath so deep it hurt trying to steady my voice. Did anyone verify his credentials with Cynthia Lopez? Did anyone bother to ask him why he was here before assuming the worst? The question echoed in my head. If it wasn't my son, if it was someone else's boy, someone without a father in a position of power, would they ever get the chance to explain? Stone's jaw clenched. The pilots nearest the door began shifting uncomfortably, as though they feared the confrontation might suck them in like a vacuum. The tall one with gray hair scratched his cheek nervously, his uniform crisp but eyes clouded with doubt. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if he'd once believed in fairness, and if he regretted the ease with which he'd let prejudice win today. A wave of memories crashed over me the first time I'd walked into a cockpit jump seat as a young inspector. The way the captain's eyes had narrowed when he saw my dark skin and assumed I was lost. The countless moments I'd swallowed anger just to survive in this field I loved. Now, seeing Isaiah face the same poison, I felt the old wounds split open all over again. From the corner of my eye, I caught a flicker of movement. One of the security officers, his face sun-weathered and lined with experience, stepped forward. His radio hissed faintly at his side, the static crackling like a warning. He cleared his throat, eyes darting between Stone and me. "Sir, if you could provide identification, we can confirm your relation to the young man and clarify this situation." I could have shouted. I could have demanded they check the badge themselves. Instead, I pulled my FAA credentials from my breast pocket, the plastic card warm against my palm. The embossed seal glinted under the harsh fluorescent lights. "I am Malcolm Bennett, Administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration." I said, my voice steady but low enough that it forced them to lean in and listen. "And this is my son. Now tell me again, do you truly believe he doesn't belong here?" The air seemed to freeze, every molecule hanging heavy with the weight of my words. Even the old vending machine fell silent, its usual hum a hollow absence. I could almost taste the metallic tang of ozone, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. My inner voice thundered a question. How many other children had been quietly pushed out of opportunities like this, and how many parents never had the chance or the power to stand here and fight back? Stone's face turned a blotchy shade of red, her eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, perhaps, or a desperate need to cling to the authority she felt slipping from her grasp. But before she could speak, Isaiah's small, shaking voice rose beside me, fragile yet unbroken. "Dad, I did everything right, I swear." I put a hand on his back, feeling the sweat dampening his shirt. "I know, son," I said, letting him hear the quiet conviction in my voice. "I know." The crowd watched us, and I realized that in this single moment, we were all deciding what kind of industry we wanted to build, one rooted in suspicion and bias, or one that could finally learn to trust and believe in every child's right to reach for the sky. Would they choose courage, or would silence win yet again? The silence cracked like thin ice as I stood there, my hand resting on Isaiah's narrow shoulders. I felt the weight of every eye fixed on us, each gaze a silent verdict suspended in the air. My breathing was slow, deliberate, the way I'd learned to do before tense meetings or turbulent flights. It steadied me even as my heart thudded so violently I thought they might hear it. Somewhere in the room, the faint scent of jet fuel drifted in from the tarmac beyond the glass, harsh and strangely comforting a smell I'd always associated with the possibilities now tainted by the bitterness of this moment. A pilot near the back cleared his throat, the sound sharp and jarring in the charged silence. He looked young, maybe mid-20s, still clutching his cap like a talisman. His eyes darted between Stone and me, then down to Isaiah, who stood impossibly small in the shadow of so many adults. The young pilot's lips parted, as if he wanted to speak, to object maybe, or to apologize. But no words came, only a faint squeak of leather as he shifted on his polished shoes. The hesitation rippled across the crowd. They were all waiting like a flock of birds, uncertain whether to scatter or stay. I wondered, did any of them feel ashamed, or did they quietly tell themselves they'd done nothing wrong because they hadn't shouted or laid a hand on my son? Stone's voice finally cut through brittle as cracked glass. "Mr. Bennett, we take security breaches very seriously. We were acting out of caution." Her words grated against every nerve I had. The old argument of just following protocol, as if protocol was a shield for prejudice, as if caution demanded crushing a child's dreams under the weight of suspicion. I felt a bitter taste on my tongue, like licking a penny, metallic and sour. I glanced down at Isaiah, who was staring straight ahead, his eyes bright but unfocused. In that moment, I saw the flicker of something I feared more than anything, the possibility that he might start to believe what they'd tried to paint him as, that he might think he didn't belong in the sky he loved so fiercely. So I spoke, letting the words flow low and firm. "Captain Stone, my son's badge was issued by Horizon's own HR. He's part of your sponsored program. Your caution should have led you to verify with your team, not assume the worst based on his appearance." A few heads bobbed in hesitant agreement, and I seized the moment. "You say you value security?" I continued, letting the quiet anger in my chest color my words. "But what security are we protecting if the price is a child's dignity? What message are we sending if the cost of caution is to crush a young man's hope before it even takes flight?" My question roared inside me. When did this industry lose its humanity? A shift passed through the room like a breeze. The young pilot swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. An older woman with silver hair and captain's bars looked away, her eyes suddenly glossy, as though seeing something she wished she could unsee. I stepped forward just enough to close the space between me and Stone. I kept my voice measured, but the steel in it was unmistakable. If we're serious about safety, we also need to be serious about integrity, about ensuring our fears don't trample the very people we claim to protect. My mind flashed back to my first flight review as a young FAA inspector, the sour coffee breath of a captain who'd refused to look me in the eye as I briefed him on safety protocols, the hollow apology that had come only after my supervisor reminded him of my authority, the humiliation I'd buried vowing that my children would never endure the same. Yet here I stood, feeling history try to repeat itself, but not on my watch. Stone's eyes darted to the security team as though searching for someone to step in and rescue her. The officers shifted, but no one moved. They knew just as well as she did that the tide had turned. The power balance had shifted, and the momentum of truth was no longer on her side. Isaiah's hand trembled as he reached up to clutch mine. His grip was tight, his palm damp, but it grounded me like nothing else could. I squeezed back, silent reassurance passing between us like a current. I wanted him to feel it, the certainty that he was not alone, not now, not ever. The lounge felt stifling, the recycled air, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. I wondered as my eyes swept over the gathered crowd, how many of them would remember this moment tomorrow. Would they look at every child who walked into an airport differently, or would they bury their discomfort under the convenient blanket of silence? I forced myself to keep my gaze steady, to stand tall, because this was more than just about Isaiah. It was about every black child who dared to dream of the sky, Every kid who needed to know they had a place up there. And it was about a father who refused to let those dreams be grounded by ignorance ever again. Time slowed to a crawl in the moments that followed, each tick of the wall clock slicing through the silence like a blade. The faint hum of distant jet engines vibrated through the lounge floor, a low, thrumming reminder of the world still moving beyond these glass walls. My mind, though, was fixed firmly on the faces in front of me, the ones who had stood by, some with indifference, some with thinly veiled discomfort, as Captain Stone tried to break my son. Isaiah's breathing was shallow, each inhale quick and ragged, his chest rising and falling like he'd just sprinted a mile. I rested my hand on his back, feeling the rapid thump of his heartbeat through the thin cotton of his shirt. The thought stabbed through me like an icicle. Would he ever walk into an airport again without feeling that cold knot of fear in his stomach? Stone's eyes darted around as the seconds dragged on, her confidence visibly draining away. She opened her mouth twice like a fish gasping for air, but no words came. I almost felt sorry for her, almost, until I remembered the way she'd looked at my son, as if he were something dirty she'd found under her shoe. I stepped forward, closing the distance, and every eye followed. The scent of burnt coffee from the nearby vending machine drifted into my nose, sharp and bitter, mixing with the tang of stale air conditioning. It reminded me of all the long nights I'd spent in airports over the decades, fighting for safety, fighting for respect, fighting for a seat at a table that was never built with people like me in mind. I lowered my voice so only Stone could hear, letting the words strike like hammers. The boy you tried to humiliate is the future of this industry. He's the kind of mind aviation needs, not just to survive, but to evolve. My tone hardened. But your fear, your prejudice, those things have no place in the cockpit or anywhere else an honest heart wants to fly by. Stone swallowed her Adam's apple, bobbing like a cork in rough water. A fine sheen of sweat broke out along her hairline, catching the harsh fluorescent light overhead. I wondered then, almost idly, would she tell herself later that this was all just a misunderstanding, that she'd only been doing her job, or would she face the truth of what she'd done? Behind me, I felt Isaiah's small voice, almost too quiet to hear. "Dad, are we going home now?" The words were fragile, brittle with the strain of holding himself together. I fought the urge to sweep him into my arms, right there to shield him from every cruel stare, every poisoned word. But I knew I couldn't, not yet. This wasn't just about comforting my son anymore. It was about ensuring no other child would stand here alone in the future. My internal debate clawed at me like talons. Was I making this worse by standing my ground, forcing a confrontation that could humiliate him further? Or was I giving him the one thing I never had, the unshakable proof that he deserved to be here, no matter who tried to tell him otherwise? I scanned the room, eyes meeting the pilots, ground crew, and airport staff who had gathered like curious crows. A few shifted uncomfortably under my gaze, their faces flickering with something like shame. Others looked away, entirely unable to meet the quiet storm of a father's fury. "Let me be clear," I said, turning so my voice carried to every corner of the lounge. "My name is Curtis Bennett. I am the Administrator of the Federal Aviation Authority, and you have all just witnessed not only a breach of protocol, but an unforgivable betrayal of the trust every passenger and every aspiring pilot places in this industry." A ripple passed through the crowd, a sharp intake of breath, a soft gasp, a stunned silence more absolute than any shout. I saw it land on Stone like a punch to the gut, her knees almost buckling under the realization. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to tilt around us, as if even the walls had to recalibrate themselves to this new reality. My hand squeezed Isaiah's shoulder. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with disbelief, as if seeing me, really seeing me for the first time. In those eyes, I caught a reflection of the boy I used to be, small, afraid, desperate to believe that someone would stand up for me. Now I was that someone, and I would never let him down. I could almost taste the air then, sharp and electric, charged with the unspoken question burning in every mind present. Would the industry change after this? Would any of them remember how quickly a moment of bias could burn a lifetime of hope to ash? And deep down, I wondered, was this the start of something better, or just another story destined to fade from memory? When the next flight took off, I could feel the floor almost vibrating beneath my feet, like the building itself was holding its breath. Outside the tall windows, a 737 began its slow taxi toward the runway, sunlight glinting off its fuselage. The roar of its engines rumbled through the glass, a reminder that while our little world had ground to a halt in this lounge, The airport, the world would keep moving indifferent to our crisis. But I couldn't afford to be indifferent. Not when my son was watching my every move, his trust in me, in everything I'd ever told him about fairness and justice, hanging by a frayed thread. I turned to the security officers standing awkwardly behind Captain Stone. Their eyes flicked between me and her, uncertainty etched into every line of their faces. I remembered being their age, fresh out of training, desperate to do the right thing, yet terrified of crossing someone in a uniform with more stripes. It was a trap I'd seen destroy good people, obedience twisted into complicity. I let the silence stretch until it became unbearable, until the tick of the second hand on the wall clock thundered like a hammer in everyone's ears. Then, with a quiet firmness I'd honed over decades in this industry, I spoke. You two have a choice to make right now. Will you stand behind this injustice, or will you uphold the values you swore to protect when you took this job? One officer shifted his weight uncomfortably, the scent of stale sweat and cheap cologne wafting over as he fidgeted. The other, younger and with a pimpled cheek that betrayed his nervousness, cleared his throat, but no words came. Their silence was answer enough. Neither man moved to grab Isaiah again. Neither so much as touched their radios. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt a faint sense of control returning. But it was Isaiah's trembling hand sliding into mine that gave me strength. His small fingers curled tightly around mine, like he believed, truly believed, that I could keep him safe. I glanced down at him, and an old memory surged up. My father standing in front of our front door, blocking two police officers who'd come to check on our family because someone in the neighborhood thought we didn't belong. I remembered how tall he'd looked that day, how unbreakable. Even when he'd been scared, he never let it show. Now I knew what that fear felt like and why he'd hidden it. The stale chill of the lounge's recycled air scratched at the back of my throat as I turned back to Captain Stone. Her eyes darted frantically from face to face, searching for an ally who wouldn't come. The sheen of sweat on her brow had thickened, darkening the roots of her blonde hair. I almost pitied her. Almost. My voice, when it came, was low and steady. I'm giving you a chance, Captain Stone. A chance to do what's right, not for me, not even for my son, but for yourself. Apologize. Admit your mistake. And maybe, just maybe, you can salvage a shred of the respect you've just thrown away. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out except a dry, rattling breath. The question pounded through my head like a drumbeat. Would she choose humility, or would her pride, the same pride that had almost destroyed my son, drag her even deeper into the hole she dug? I caught movement in the periphery of my vision. More pilots and staff gathering at the glass doors, drawn by the tension bleeding into the corridor like a silent alarm. Their eyes glittered with curiosity, discomfort, even fear. I wondered how many of them recognized themselves in this moment, how many had looked at someone like my son with the same quick, unthinking suspicion. My heart ached as I thought of Isaiah's first flight alone, a short hop from Chicago to Kansas City at 12 years old, how he'd gripped his boarding pass with a grin wide enough to light the whole terminal. He'd been so proud, so certain the skies were his. Had I lied to him by telling him the world was fair? I could feel his eyes on me, and questioning, would his father live up to every promise he'd made about standing tall when it mattered? My internal debate burned hotter than ever. Was it worth humiliating this woman in front of her peers if it taught them all a lesson? Or was I sinking to the same level of cruelty I despised? The air seemed thicker, heavier, each breath an effort. The sour tang of burnt coffee still lingered, mixing now with the sterile chemical bite of floor polish. A bead of sweat traced down my spine, chilling me as it went. I felt every second stretch, every judgmental gaze press into me. Captain Stone's eyes finally met mine. There was a flicker there, shame, fear, or maybe just the realization that the world she'd ruled with unchallenged confidence had shifted. But what would she do with that knowledge? And as I held her gaze, I asked myself the question that had haunted me since I'd walked through the lounge doors. Could one moment of truth in one quiet room really change an entire industry's heart? Captain Stone's lips parted, then pressed together again, like she was chewing on words too bitter to swallow. The hush in the lounge grew deeper, every breath and shifting footstep amplified until it felt like the entire terminal had gone silent to hear what she might say. I could almost hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, a faint, maddening buzz that set my teeth on edge. I waited, not speaking, refusing to fill the silence for her. I'd learned over a lifetime that the most powerful pressure came not from shouting, but from the quiet expectation that someone would do the right thing. Yet each second that ticked by, my hope dimmed. My heart clenched when I felt Isaiah's grip on my hand tighten. His skin was warm, the sweat of fear or resolve dampening our joined palms. A part of me wanted to shield him from every glance, every cold whisper, but another part knew he had to see this through. He had to know what it looked like when you stood your ground. Then she finally spoke, her voice, a hollow, trembling thing that betrayed just how far she'd fallen from her pedestal. I, I didn't realize. I was only trying to. She stopped. Her eyes dropped from mine to the carpet where a faint stain shaped like an oil slick spread near the base of the vending machine, a stain I suddenly remembered noticing when I first entered, odd and ugly, like a bruise on the airport's polished perfection. Would anyone believe me if I told them how fast a room could flip from righteous fury to hollow discomfort? That in the span of a single heartbeat, the crowd's curiosity soured into awkwardness, as if the very air had turned stale from shared guilt. Stone cleared her throat, her gaze flitting from my son to the security officers who still hovered like confused shadows behind her. I apologize, she mumbled at last. I may have misjudged the situation. May have. The words landed like a slap. She couldn't even admit it outright. And yet, as her voice cracked, I saw a spark of something that might one day grow into self-awareness if she let it. But the apology, half-hearted as it was, didn't wipe away the hours Isaiah had spent caught in a web of fear and humiliation. Didn't erase the scars he'd carry into every future flight, every boarding gate, every unfamiliar waiting room. And it didn't absolve me of the question I still carried: how many other children had been chased from their dreams by moments just like this? A faint scent of jet fuel drifted in through the vents, sharp and metallic, grounding me in the present. I took a slow breath, choosing my words carefully. You don't apologize to me, I said, my voice soft but firm. You apologize to my son. He's the one you hurt. He's the one who stood here alone while you judged him for daring to dream. The hush deepened, every face in the crowd fixed on Captain Stone. A subtle rustle moved through them, shifting feet, uncomfortable coughs, the faint rattle of someone's boarding pass, but not a soul looked away. Captain Stone swallowed hard. I could see her throat bob in the fluorescent glare. She shifted her weight, her polished shoes squeaking slightly against the linoleum. I, I'm sorry, Isaiah, she said, forcing his name out like it burned her tongue. I shouldn't have assumed. Isaiah's eyes met hers with a courage I wasn't sure I would have had at his age. His voice, small but unwavering, broke the spell of silence. I know I belong here, he said quietly, his words like a blade cutting through the haze of tension. I worked hard to be here. I won't let you or anyone else make me feel like I don't. The surge of pride and pain that hit me then nearly buckled my knees. My son's words carried the weight of every lesson I tried to teach him and every lesson my own father had tried to teach me. The realization struck hard. Maybe the best I could do wasn't to shield him from every wound, but to stand beside him as he faced them. The crowd began to shift, not with hostility, but with something like uneasy respect. A few pilots nodded subtly. One woman near the back pressed her lips together, eyes glassy, as if seeing her own mistakes reflected in Stone's downfall. The room felt different now, charged with a quiet potential I hadn't sensed before. I felt Isaiah's fingers relax slightly in mine. He straightened his shoulders, chin held a little higher, and in that moment I saw not a scared boy, but the man he was growing into, someone who would one day tower over the fear that had tried to keep him small. My mind buzzed with the question I couldn't escape. Had I just witnessed the first crack in the armor of prejudice at this airport? Or would this moment fade forgotten by everyone except the boy who had to live with it forever? A strange hush settled over the lounge after Isaiah's words, as if the walls themselves were listening. The crackling of the overhead speaker announcing a distant flight felt jarringly normal, like a reminder that the world beyond this room kept spinning, while ours had just shifted forever. Captain Stone's eyes darted around, searching the crowd for an ally who wasn't there. Her hands, once steady on the yoke of a jetliner, now fidgeted like a nervous child's fingers, clenching and unclenching, as though grasping for control of a situation that had slipped beyond her reach. I felt my pulse thud in my ears, each beat echoing with the memory of the moments just before I arrived, the images I'd pieced together from security footage, eyewitness accounts, and my own son's terrified voice. How he must have felt alone under those cold fluorescent lights, judged by strangers who saw his skin before his heart. There was a sharp, acrid scent in the air, like burned coffee left on the warmer too long. It mingled with the sterile tang of floor cleaner, a smell that reminded me of countless red-eye flights of nights spent cradling Isaiah's head as he slept across my lap in cheap vinyl airport chairs, of promises whispered to him over the roar of jet engines that he could be anything, go anywhere, fly higher than I ever had. Would anyone ever understand the rage that simmers just beneath the surface when you know your child was targeted, not for what he did, but for who he is? One of the pilots broke the silence, his voice quiet but carrying. "Captain Stone, you owe this boy more than words," he said, gaze steady but sad. His wings glinted under the harsh light, silver and blue, a symbol of flight and freedom now tainted by what had happened here. Another step forward, an older woman with lines etched deep into her sun-browned face. She looked at Isaiah with a softness I hadn't expected. "You belong here," she told him simply, her words falling into the quiet like a promise. "Don't let this keep you grounded." A ripple of agreement moved through the gathered crew. Nods murmured words of apology, not just to Isaiah, but to me too. I felt something shift inside my chest, an ache easing like a muscle unclenching after holding tension too long. Yet I couldn't shake the question that echoed in my mind. Would they remember this tomorrow? Or would they slip back into the comfort of silence, leaving the burden on kids like Isaiah to keep proving they deserve to be here? Captain Stone's face crumpled. She looked smaller than I'd ever imagined her, a woman unmoored from the authority she'd once wielded with ease. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, voice hoarse. "I thought I was protecting everyone. I thought—" The security team shifted awkwardly behind her. One officer's radio let out a burst of static, startling everyone. The crackle faded, leaving a raw, uncomfortable quiet. I wanted to tell her that her intentions didn't matter, that the harm had been done. But I also felt the weight of every lesson I'd learned as a black man, moving through a world that wasn't built for me, that sometimes grace costs more than anger. And sometimes it's the only thing that can break the cycle. I took a slow breath, letting it fill the tight spaces in my chest before I spoke. "This isn't about who you thought you were protecting," I told her, voice low but clear. "It's about who you failed to see. My son isn't a threat. He's a boy with a dream you nearly shattered." She looked up, eyes red, lips pressed together so hard they trembled. Isaiah squeezed my hand, a signal that he was still here, still whole. I squeezed back, grounding him as much as he grounded me. The years stretched behind me like the contrails of a plane, moments of triumph and pain, times when I doubted myself, times when I believed the world might finally change. Each memory reminded me how fragile hope could be. My heart ached with a question I couldn't voice. Had I done enough to prepare him for this? Or had I filled his head with stories of possibility, without warning him that sometimes people would try to clip his wings before he ever left the ground? A faint voice came over the intercom announcing final boarding for a flight to Seattle. The sound felt surreal, like background noise in a movie, but it brought a strange sense of clarity. Life would keep moving, planes would take off. The world wouldn't pause for us, but we could choose how we stepped forward. I looked down at Isaiah, his eyes shining not with tears now, but with something fiercer, more determined. I realized this moment wasn't just an ending. It was the first step into the sky he'd always dreamed of. The hush in the lounge slowly unraveled as conversations resumed in cautious murmurs. Each voice seemed to echo a shared realization that something significant had just happened here, something none of us would soon forget. I stood in the center of it all, the floor beneath my polished shoes feeling oddly unsteady, as if the building itself had been rattled by the truth laid bare. My eyes swept the room, seeing pilots shifting awkwardly, security officers avoiding my gaze, and airport staff whispering among themselves. The tension hung in the recycled air like a storm cloud that refused to break. I caught a faint whiff of ozone, sharp and metallic, seeping from the old vents. The kind of smell I associated with thunderstorms on the tarmac, a reminder of forces far larger than ourselves. It reminded me of standing on the runway as a young man mesmerized by lightning that danced in distant skies, believing nothing could touch me so long as I dreamed big enough. But reality has a way of teaching us otherwise. Captain Stone's shoulders sagged, her authoritative bearing slipping further away with every second. She tried to find words, but only a strained rasp came out, each syllable betraying the unraveling of a certainty she'd once worn like armor. A voice inside me wrestled with a question I couldn't silence. Should I offer her forgiveness now, or let the weight of her actions linger a little longer? Would immediate mercy teach anything, or only excuse the damage done? Isaiah pressed closer to me, his small hand clammy but strong. He looked up, and in his eyes I saw not just fear, but a flicker of something new, resilience. That spark filled me with pride and a pang of guilt. Pride because he hadn't crumbled. Guilt because I knew he never should have had to prove his worth in the first place. A young flight attendant stepped forward, her neat bun trembling slightly as she spoke. She couldn't have been more than 25, yet the raw honesty in her eyes was older than time. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice quiet but clear enough for everyone to hear. "We should have spoken up sooner." Her words cut through the stale air like a breath of fresh wind. Heads turned. Some looked ashamed, others relieved that someone had dared to break the silence. A middle-aged pilot nodded solemnly, adding, "I knew it wasn't right. I should have said something." I wanted to tell them that it mattered, that silence can be a prison, and breaking it even late can change everything. But part of me wondered, was this contrition genuine, or just fear of what my badge and authority could bring down on them? The polished glass doors at the far end of the lounge reflected the sterile airport lights, turning every movement into a ghostly double. My own reflection stared back at me, eyes dark with fatigue, forehead creased with the burden of decades spent navigating spaces like this, spaces where I always had to prove I belonged. I felt the anger pulse hot and alive in my chest, a thudding reminder that the fight wasn't over. But alongside it bloomed a gentler resolve that Isaiah would see a different way forward, a way where he wouldn't have to carry the same unspoken armor into every room. The room fell silent again when a uniformed FAA investigator stepped through the doors, clipboard in hand. His eyes moved swiftly from Captain Stone to me, then to Isaiah. He paused as if weighing not just the facts, but the gravity of what had unfolded. I caught the faint scent of jet fuel on his jacket, a scent I'd always loved, though it now smelled tainted, like a symbol of an industry that could still betray its own. He began to speak, his voice measured, words deliberate. "We've completed our initial review," he announced, tone neutral, but edged with an authority that hushed even the faintest whisper. "We have clear evidence that Isaiah was authorized to be here and was treated unfairly." My breath caught. I felt Isaiah shift beside me, his shoulders relaxing just a fraction as the words sank in. Captain Stone's face turned the color of old paper. Her mouth opened, but no words came. She looked smaller now, a diminished figure dwarfed by the truth she could no longer control. A part of me wanted to shout, to rail against the years of casual cruelty hidden behind polite smiles. But the wiser, older part of me, the part hardened by experience, knew that real change doesn't come from rage alone. It comes from exposure, from truth, made undeniable from eyes forced open. I wondered aloud in my mind, would these people carry this lesson forward? Or would the memory fade the moment Isaiah and I stepped out of their sight? The investigator's eyes met mine, steady and searching. "Administrator Jackson," he said formally, but with a note of respect. "Would you like to add anything to the official record?" I swallowed the lump in my throat, feeling the full weight of what I was about to say. I glanced down at my son, his bright eyes still shining despite everything. Then I looked up at every face watching us, gathering the threads of years of pain, hope, and relentless determination. "This isn't just about my son," I said, my voice low but carrying. "It's about every child who's been told they don't belong. About every silent witness who thinks someone else will speak up. We all have a duty, not just to fly these planes, but to lift each other up." The investigator nodded, once solemn and sure. The silence that followed felt different than before, heavier, yes, but also more honest, a silence that promised something could finally change. The hush that followed my words was unlike any silence I'd ever felt in an airport lounge. It was thick with recognition, like the collective exhale of people realizing they'd just witnessed a truth too raw to ignore. I could almost hear hearts beating under the thin fabric of neatly pressed uniforms. The investigator's pen hovered for a second before moving again, the soft scratch of it on paper oddly soothing amid the tense quiet. I watched his steady hand and thought about how many reports like this he must have filed, how many lives had been crushed or redeemed by a few words scribbled on a form. A bitter taste clung to the back of my tongue, a metallic tang that reminded me of biting my lip during the first time I'd faced a similar moment decades ago, when a flight school instructor looked at me like I'd walked in the wrong door. Even now, older and seasoned, the sting still lingered. Maybe it always would. Isaiah's small voice pulled me back. "Dad," he whispered, his eyes shining but shadowed with confusion. "Are they going to take her away?" His question rang in the room like a bell, his innocence cutting deeper than any accusation could. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to shield him from the answer, to spare him the truth of what happens when someone abuses power so badly they can't come back from it. But he deserved honesty. I'd promised myself that long ago. Yes, son, I said softly, the words tasting like cold steel. They're going to make sure she can't do this to anyone else. A ripple moved through the lounge. Some people shifted their weight uncomfortably, as if my words had broken the fragile armor they wore. Others nodded slightly, the realization dawning that they too had a role in what had happened, whether by their actions or by the silence they'd kept. The scent of burnt coffee drifted over from the vending machine at the far wall, stale and acrid, mingling with the faint antiseptic smell that always seemed to linger in airport spaces. It reminded me how many hours I'd spent in places like this, waiting for flights or meetings, trying to look like I belonged in a world that often tried to push me out. A question pressed heavy in my chest. Would any of these people have stepped in if my badge hadn't carried the weight of the FAA behind it? Or would they have kept watching, letting Isaiah's dreams suffocate under the weight of suspicion and whispers? Captain Stone's eyes flicked to mine for a fleeting second, and in them I saw something almost like regret. But it was quickly swallowed by fear, fear of what losing everything meant for her. Her lips parted like she wanted to plead, but the investigator's voice cut through the air first. Captain Stone, he said, every syllable clipped and certain effective immediately. You are relieved of all duties pending a full investigation. His words fell like hammer blows, final and irrevocable. Her face crumpled, but she held her head high as if trying to cling to the last scraps of her dignity. She took a step back, and her polished shoes scuffed the tile with a squeak that seemed deafening in the quiet room. A sensory memory flashed in my mind. The squeal of brakes on wet tarmac, the way it made my stomach lurch the first time I taxied a jetliner as a young pilot. It was a sound I'd learned to respect, a reminder that control can slip away in an instant. The two security officers who'd once looked at Isaiah like he was a criminal now stepped forward with hesitant deference. They flanked Stone, their expressions carefully blank. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same men who nearly dragged my son away were now escorting the woman who had started it all. A hush fell again as they led her out. The clicking of her heels faded down the hall like the last rattling note of a song no one wanted to hear. I watched until the door closed behind them, feeling the tension in my chest ease, just enough to let me draw a shaky breath. But I knew this wasn't the end. There were still lessons that needed to be taught, changes that needed to be made. And Isaiah needed to see that strength wasn't about shouting or revenge, but about standing firm when the world tries to knock you down. I knelt so my eyes were level with his, the cool tile biting into my knees. His eyes were wet lashes clumped together, but he didn't look away. Isaiah, I said quietly, my voice low enough that only he could hear what happened. Today wasn't your fault. Remember that. And never let anyone tell you you don't belong. His face twisted like he was fighting tears, but then he nodded, his chin firming. It was such a small gesture, but it carried the weight of generations who had been told to sit down and stay quiet. My heart swelled with fierce pride. Standing again, I faced the pilots and staff still gathered. My voice carried across the room, measured and resolute. Let this moment remind you all, we are judged not just by how we act, but by what we allow. Silence can be as cruel as words. A silence followed, heavier than before, but this time it felt like a silence that could lead to something better. Hush before an apology, the pause before real change. I don't know how long I stood there, eyes sweeping across the lounge, searching every face for a sign they understood the depth of what had just happened. The fluorescent lights above buzzed softly like a restless insect trapped in glass, adding a low hum to the heavy silence. It made the air feel thicker, like the entire room was holding its breath. Someone finally broke the stillness. A mechanic in grease-stained overalls who'd been lingering near the doorway, his wrench tucked into his belt. His voice was rough, but his eyes shone with something like respect. Mr. Cooper. He began addressing me directly. I've got kids of my own. I'm sorry we didn't speak up sooner. The words tumbled out awkwardly, but they felt genuine, and for a moment the knot in my chest loosened just a bit. I gave him a small nod, gratitude threading through the exhaustion in my bones. His apology wouldn't undo what happened, but it showed the ripple effect of truth spoken aloud. Others began shifting, murmurs spreading like the first tentative raindrops of a storm, quiet, but signaling change. I caught a whiff of old jet fuel drifting in from the taxiway beyond the staff doors. The sharp, oily scent triggered a memory from my early days flying regional jets, standing on the tarmac at dawn breath, fogging in the cold, feeling like the sky was mine to conquer. Back then, I believed my uniform would be a shield against the world's worst assumptions. But time had taught me even the highest rank couldn't always protect you from the lowliest prejudice. Isaiah stood at my side, his small hand wrapping around my pinky, squeezing tight. His eyes darted from face to face, searching for something, maybe understanding, maybe safety. I wondered what lessons he'd carry from today, whether they would leave him more cautious or more determined. I couldn't help but ask myself the question clawing at the edges of my thoughts. Would he grow up believing the world could change for the better, or would he learn to shrink himself to avoid trouble? Taking a steadying breath, I forced my voice to stay even as I spoke to the gathered staff pilots and onlookers. I know many of you felt powerless watching this unfold, but know this: standing by in silence can leave deeper scars than any words or actions. The next time you see injustice, remember what it looked like today, and remember what it took to stop it. As I spoke, my mind kept returning to one peculiar detail: the faint, almost sweet smell of old carpet glue in the lounge. It clung to everything, a strange, cloying reminder of a place designed to keep people comfortable. But comfort, I realized, is a privilege denied to those who must constantly justify their right to simply exist. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Captain Amara James slip quietly into the room. She wore her uniform like a badge of honor, head held high, her eyes shining with fierce empathy. Amara was one of the first black female captains I'd met when I rose through the ranks, and seeing her now felt like a balm on a raw wound. She moved straight toward Isaiah, crouching until she was eye level with him. "Hey, young man," she said gently, her voice smooth like velvet. "You love airplanes, right?" He nodded, his lip trembling, but his gaze locked on her with quiet awe. "Well, how about you come see the cockpit of my plane? I think you've more than earned it today." Isaiah's eyes went wide, his hand still gripping mine, but his shoulders lifting like a weight had been peeled off. I glanced at Amara, gratitude swelling in my chest. She knew exactly what he needed: a moment to remember the wonder of flight instead of the injustice that tried to steal it from him. I looked around one last time before we left the lounge. The faces watching us were different now, thoughtful, chastened, some even ashamed. They looked at Isaiah like he was a child again, not a threat, not an intruder, and I prayed that image would linger in their minds long after we were gone. My mind drifted back to my first solo flight, how the roar of the engines and the trembling air beneath my wings made me feel unstoppable. I wanted that same feeling for Isaiah, to show him that, though people may doubt him, the sky would never close its doors. I held his hand as we followed Captain James out of the lounge, the hush of the room falling behind us like a heavy curtain. Each step felt lighter, more certain, as if we were already ascending, leaving behind the stale air of doubt and stepping toward the boundless expanse waiting just beyond the runway. But even as we walked, the question still burned quietly in my heart. Would the lesson of today sink deep enough to change these hearts, or would they forget the moment the doors closed behind us? The corridor to the jetway felt strangely quiet, the muted thump of our shoes echoing down its narrow stretch. Isaiah clutched my hand like it was the only stable thing left in his world, and maybe it was. The faint metallic tang of the air reminded me of countless pre-flight checks, the hush before engines roared to life. That smell, the cold recycled breeze tinged with aluminum, always brought me peace. Today, it carried a harder edge. As we neared Captain James's 737, I caught glimpses of flight attendants peeking curiously from the galley, their eyes widening when they recognized Amara at the head of our small procession. She carried herself like a queen, and seeing her reminded me how many battles she'd fought, some in the skies, but most on the ground against the same quiet, insidious barriers Isaiah had just tasted for the first time. Stepping through the cockpit door, I felt the familiar thrill. Even after all these years, the dense scent of heated electronics, the soft hum of avionics coming to life, the warmth of sun-drenched panels. Isaiah gasped at the sight, the sprawling array of button screens glowing like tiny galaxies, yokes waiting for steady hands. His wonder shimmered in the cabin light, brighter than anything else. "See this champ," I told him, softly lifting him up so he could settle into the left seat. "This is the captain's chair. Someday you'll sit here for real." He looked up at me with wishing, shining eyes, and I hoped he saw the unshakable belief I had in him. He deserved that faith, even if the world too often demanded he prove himself twice over. Captain James pointed to the throttle levers and began explaining every knob and switch with patience that only came from years of experience and heartbreak. Her voice was calm like a lullaby, layered over the steady tick of cooling metal. I leaned back for a moment, letting her words wash over me, remembering a time when I was just as small, listening to my father describe how wings held the sky. Would Isaiah remember this moment as a spark of hope, or a reminder of what nearly crushed him? That question twisted in my chest like a blade sharp and unanswerable. From the cockpit, I looked out the forward window at the tarmac blazing under the late afternoon sun. Heat waves rose in shimmering layers, distorting the horizon into rippling uncertainty. It felt like a perfect metaphor for the day. The closer you got to the truth, the more it wavered and danced, almost impossible to pin down. I thought of my father again, how he'd warned me that no title, no achievement could ever fully shield me from prejudice. But he'd also taught me that when injustice came, it was my duty to meet it head on, not just for myself, but for every kid who'd walked the same path after me. As Amara finished her demonstration, she rested a hand on Isaiah's shoulder and met my gaze. "I've got a little time before my next flight," she said softly, a steel edge beneath her gentle tone. "Let him stay here as long as he wants. Let him know this place is his too." The words lodged in my throat, heavy with gratitude and grief. I could only nod, pressing my hand against Isaiah's back as he beamed at the instrument panel, his fingers fluttering over the yoke like a pianist testing new keys. From behind, I heard muffled announcements over the airport intercom, the drone of boarding calls and last chance warnings. Life was moving on out there, indifferent to the war we just fought. Part of me wanted to step outside, to stand tall, and force every passerby to look us in the eye, to remember what had almost been lost. I wondered then if justice could ever truly fix the damage done. Would those who watched from the sidelines learn or just feel relief? It wasn't their turn in the crosshairs. Would the weight of what had happened fade from their memories before it had a chance to change them? The thought made my stomach twist, but I pushed it aside, focusing instead on Isaiah's laughter, light and clear, ringing out as he mimicked radio calls, his imagination soaring far above the doubts that had tried to pin him down. My eyes swept over the switches and displays I'd memorized over decades. Each light, each dial felt like an old friend whispering, "You belong here. This place is yours." It struck me how often I'd taken that sense of belonging for granted, how easily it could be stolen by a single hateful glance or careless word. I closed my eyes for a moment, the low hiss of the air conditioning blending with Isaiah's excited voice. Would anyone else in this building remember how close they'd come to destroying a boy's dream? Or would they tuck it away, an uncomfortable footnote, in an otherwise ordinary day? As I opened my eyes, I found Isaiah looking back at me, his smile wide and hopeful. In that gaze, I saw the only answer that mattered. As long as he could dream, we still had a chance to make the world better. The cockpit felt like a warm cocoon as we lingered, time slipping into a hushed lull. Isaiah's small hands traced the contours of the throttle levers, eyes darting to the overhead panel, then down to the illuminated displays. Each beep of a test system seemed to delight him, his grin growing wider with every soft chime. For a few blessed minutes, the fear and humiliation of the pilot's lounge melted away, replaced by pure wonder. I sat in the jump seat behind him, leather cracked and stub beneath me, its aged scent tinged with the faint aroma of old coffee. That smell triggered a cascade of memories. The long-haul flights when I was first certified, the sleepless red-eyes across stormy skies, the subtle pride of slipping my wings onto my uniform for the first time. Back then, I'd thought the cockpit was a refuge from the world below, a place where only skill and discipline mattered. But life had taught me otherwise. As Captain James explained the autopilot systems with gentle precision, I found myself lost in thought. How many times had I doubted my own place in these seats? How many moments had I sensed the eyes of colleagues measuring me, not by my flight hours, but by the color of my skin? Even now, decades into a career that had seen me at the controls of everything from prop planes to wide bodies, the ghosts of those judgments lingered. Would it ever truly change? Or would my son inherit the same uphill battle, a fight to prove his worth in a world still blind to his brilliance? The question burned in my chest, heavy and unanswerable. I shifted in my seat, feeling the old cushioning resist my weight like the chair itself remembered every weary captain who'd settled into it after a long day. I wondered what stories it would tell if it could speak the whispered prayers during engine failures, the quiet cheers after flawless landings, the silent tears shed for dreams realized or shattered. Isaiah giggled suddenly, snapping me from my reverie. He was flipping a guarded switch back and forth, the faint click loud in the hush of the cockpit. Captain James leaned over him, eyes twinkling, and explained how that one switch controlled the yaw damper, preventing the plane from slipping sideways in flight. The technical explanation fascinated Isaiah. I could almost see the gears turning behind his bright eyes. That light in him I thought was everything I wanted to protect. Would anyone else in that airport remember how they nearly snuffed it out? Outside the cockpit window, a baggage train rattled by the clang of carts like distant church bells on a winter morning. I caught a brief glimpse of Captain Reese and a few flight attendants peering discreetly into the cockpit. From the galley door, curiosity tempered by a newfound respect. I held their gaze, offering a nod. I hope conveyed both gratitude and a warning. We will not forget. A memory of my father's advice drifted into my mind like smoke. Son, a true pilot learns to navigate the storms outside the plane and the ones raging inside. His words felt more profound than ever, their weight and anchor in this swirling moment. Would Isaiah carry those lessons with him someday, or would he need to find his own truths in the turbulence of his time? The cockpit fell into a brief silence as Captain James paused, letting Isaiah absorb everything he'd just learned. The only sound was the faint whoosh of the ventilation system, cool air threading through the tight space. It carried the smell of jet fuel drifting from the tarmac, pungent, sharp, yet oddly comforting, a scent that had always reminded me I was where I belonged. I watched Isaiah lean forward, resting his small hands on the yoke, as though it were the wheel of a mighty ship. His shoulders straightened, his expression growing serious, eyes focused on the horizon beyond the glass. It was a moment so pure, so full of promise, it felt like time itself had slowed to witness it. Would the world outside this cockpit ever be as straightforward as the flight rules I'd memorized? I doubted it. But in here, at least for now, everything made sense. Captain James's voice broke the quiet with calm reassurance. Someday, Isaiah, you'll be the one taxiing this bird down the runway. Her words hung in the air, shimmering with possibility, settling into the corners of my heart like sacred vows. I swallowed, hard emotions rising thick in my throat. I couldn't help but wonder if I'd done enough, if fighting this one battle would be enough to spare him others down the road. The future stretched before us like an open sky, vast, breathtaking, but clouded with uncertainty. And yet as I looked at my son's face, eyes alight, chin lifted in quiet determination, a fragile hope began to take root. Maybe, just maybe, we were one step closer to the day when no child would need to fight for their place in the sky. The cockpit door swung closed behind us with a muffled clunk that seemed to seal the magic of that moment inside. As we stepped back into the terminal corridor, the hush of the cockpit gave way to the familiar drone of airport life, rolling suitcases, gate announcements echoing across the concourse, and the low hum of conversations bouncing off polished floors. I felt the shift keenly, like plunging into cold water after the warmth of a sauna. Isaiah walked just ahead of me, practically skipping, his eyes still wide with wonder. He glanced back every few steps to make sure I was there, his smile flashing like a lighthouse beam through the mic of lingering tension. I reached out, rested my hand on his shoulder, and squeezed. His small frame felt fragile under my palm, but the energy radiating from him was indomitable. As we passed by a coffee kiosk, the bitter, slightly burnt aroma of dark roast filled the air, mingling with the sharp scent of jet fuel still clinging to my clothes. It transported me straight back to the sleepless nights at flight school, cramming in study sessions, with paper cups of coffee balanced on worn manuals. Back then, I thought knowledge alone would earn me respect, but I'd learned the hard way that even perfect scores couldn't shield me from prejudice. The terminal felt different now. Where earlier eyes had watched me and Isaiah with cold suspicion, now glances lingered with a kind of cautious curiosity, even a hint of embarrassed respect. People shifted aside, letting us pass without the subtle blocks or hostile body language I'd felt before. I caught whispers, a pilot in uniform telling a flight attendant he'd just seen that FAA administrator walk by with his son, their tones hushed, the realization spreading like ripples in a pond. Would these people remember what happened today? Or would they tuck it away in the back of their minds, too uncomfortable to confront what they'd witnessed? A question gnawed at me: how many others like Isaiah had been forced to leave these corridors, in tears, their dreams crushed silently by the same invisible walls we'd just broken through? My phone buzzed in my pocket, the vibration sharp against my thigh. It was a message from the FAA Communications Office, updates about the immediate suspension of Captain Parker, and confirmation that a thorough review was already underway. I exhaled slowly, the news feeling both like vindication and a heavy burden. I'd stood up for my son, but the knowledge of what it had taken and what it revealed about the system I served weighed on me. We reached the large windows overlooking the tarmac where planes taxied in the golden afternoon light. Isaiah pressed his hands to the glass, his breath fogging a small circle as he tracked the slow ballet of aircraft. I stood beside him, scanning the horizon beyond the runways. The sky was streaked with the contrails of jets carving invisible paths, a sky I'd devoted my life to, a sky I'd always thought of as a place of freedom. Yet even up there, prejudice had tried to find us. Would the next generation of pilots and dreamers find it any easier to soar without invisible chains? Isaiah turned to me suddenly, his voice small but confident. Daddy, when I become a pilot, I'm going to make sure everyone knows they belong up there, no matter what. His words stunned me. For a heartbeat, all the noise of the terminal dropped away. Tears pricked at my eyes, but I blinked them back, not wanting to show weakness at a moment so precious. I rested a hand on the back of his neck, pride and sorrow mingling inside me like oil and water. A cleaning cart rolled past us, the faint squeak of its wheels, oddly musical amid the background din. The janitor pushing it, an older man with deep lines in his face, looked up and nodded at me. I nodded back, holding his gaze a second longer than usual, silently acknowledging a shared understanding of what it meant to be overlooked. Isaiah tugged on my sleeve, breaking the quiet. He wanted to visit the observation deck to watch the planes climb into the sky to chase the dream that had almost been stolen from him today. I hesitated, then nodded, letting him pull me along. My steps felt lighter than they had all day. Would I have had his courage at his age, or was his strength born from watching me fight for him today? The thought warmed me as we walked, the afternoon sun slanting across the floor, throwing long shadows behind us like the ghosts of old fears fading in the light. We took the elevator up to the observation deck, its glass walls offering a rising panorama of the runways, the control tower, and the endless spread of sky beyond. As we ascended, the rhythmic whir of the motor filled the silence between Isaiah and me, each floor ticking past like a quiet countdown to something new. The doors opened with a soft chime, and we stepped out into a sunlit space filled with wide windows stretching from floor to ceiling. The view was breathtaking, planes taxied in a slow, deliberate waltz, wings glinting under the setting sun's amber glow, and above them, contrails crossed the sky like chalk lines on a blue slate. Isaiah ran to the railing, pressing both hands to the glass as if he could absorb the freedom beyond. The air up here smelled faintly of warm concrete and jet exhaust, a scent I had always found strangely comforting, a reminder of every journey I'd taken, every challenge I'd overcome. I let it fill my lungs, grounding myself in a moment that felt at once fragile and eternal. Standing behind Isaiah, I reflected on how many years I had worked to reach a point where my presence alone could flip the script in a place like this. I thought of the countless times I'd been stopped in airports, questioned for lingering too long near the gates, or eyed suspiciously at security. I'd convinced myself those small humiliations were just the price to pay for chasing big dreams. But today showed me that letting those moments slide doesn't just harm me, it sets a precedent for how people like Isaiah will be treated. Would anyone have stood up for me if I'd faced what Isaiah did today? Or would they have looked away, as so many almost did? The question twisted inside me, sharper than any turbulence I'd faced at 40,000 feet. I watched Isaiah track a 737 as it lifted gracefully into the evening sky, his eyes reflecting pure awe. I could almost see his thoughts in his expression, a silent promise to himself that he'd be the one flying that plane someday. A cold draft snuck in from the edges of the observation deck, carrying the scent of ozone and spilled coffee from a nearby concession stand. It reminded me how thin the line is between comfort and discomfort, between safety and danger, and how quickly that line had shifted under Captain Parker's gaze. A man in a crisp ground crew uniform approached cautiously. His name badge read Thomas. He kept his eyes low, but when he spoke, his voice carried genuine warmth. "Mr. Rhodes, sir, I just wanted to say I saw what happened downstairs. What you did, it matters. My nephew wants to be a pilot too. Thank you for standing up." The words surprised me more than I let on. I clasped his shoulder briefly, gratitude swelling in my chest. Tell your nephew the skies are open to him, and remind him he has people who believe in him. As Thomas walked away, Isaiah looked up at me, curiosity dancing across his face. "Daddy, do you think I'll really get to fly one of those planes someday?" I smiled, the lines at the corners of my eyes deepening. "Not think, Isaiah, I know you will. And when you do, you'll do it better than anyone ever expected." He nodded solemnly, his little brow furrowing in determination. In that instant, I saw not just a boy inspired by dreams, but a boy determined to own them. My phone buzzed again, an update from the FAA's legal team confirming that Captain Parker was officially grounded, pending a full review. A sense of finality settled over me, not the bitter satisfaction of revenge, but the quiet reassurance that the system, at least this time, was working as it should. Would Parker reflect on what she'd done, or would she cling to excuses in the solitude of her suspension? Isaiah pulled me from my thoughts by pointing excitedly at a plane rotating for takeoff. His eyes were bright, his spirit unbroken. I leaned down close enough to smell the faint hint of orange juice he'd spilled on his shirt earlier, and whispered, "This is where your dream takes off, son." As we stood together, watching jet after jet claw into the sky, I realized how easily I could have lost this moment, how close Isaiah's dreams had come to being clipped by ignorance and hate. And I vowed right there in the fading light of day to never let my silence be mistaken for acceptance again. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the tarmac in deep purples and burnt oranges. Long shadows reached across the observation deck floor, like the final embrace of the day before night claimed the airport. I rested my hand on Isaiah's shoulder as we lingered, neither of us eager to leave this moment suspended between earth and sky. A voice on the loudspeaker announced the final boarding call for a flight to Seattle, its calm, precise tone slicing through the quiet. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the words drift over me, remembering the countless flights I'd taken alone, each time chasing the next promotion, the next milestone, each time hoping I was building something worthy of handing down to Isaiah. I inhaled deeply, the metallic tang of the cold steel railing, mixing with the subtle sweetness of fresh jet fuel, a scent I'd come to associate with possibility. Yet tonight it also carried the bitter edge of how close we'd come to having all of this slip away, because someone saw only a stereotype where they should have seen a child with dreams. Would Isaiah remember this as the day his father saved his dream, or as the day he first realized the world could try to steal it? I wished I could protect him from that knowledge forever, but I knew better. The world had already started teaching him hard lessons. All I could do was make sure he had the strength and the support to meet them head on. We stood there a while longer, Isaiah leaning his small frame into me, his eyes never leaving the dancing lights of the runway as planes came and went like shooting stars. In his silence, I could hear the unspoken questions, the echoes of Parker's hateful words, the fear that had threatened to take root in his heart. And I swore he would never stand alone in that fear. A faint vibration buzzed in my pocket, a text from the FAA team confirming they would review every training program, every security protocol, every bias that had slipped through the cracks until this day. The system wasn't perfect, but tonight it was on our side, and that felt like a small miracle. As we turned to leave, the last heat of the day still radiated off the glass walls, making the air shimmer. I glanced back one final time at the runway lights, feeling a quiet sense of resolve settle over me like a second skin. I thought about every kid who would follow Isaiah, every parent who would sit up nights, wondering if their child's dreams were safe. I knew I couldn't protect them all, but I could make sure our story reached as many as possible. Would you believe it if I told you a single moment of cruelty could almost unravel everything a family spent years building, or that a single act of courage could begin stitching it back together? Isaiah slipped his hand into mine, his small fingers warm and determined. As we walked down the long hallway of the observation deck, the low hum of engines reverberated through the glass, vibrating against our ribs like a promise. Tomorrow the sky would still be there waiting. And as I glanced down at Isaiah's bright, unwavering eyes, I knew he would meet that sky head-on, because tonight had proven that dreams were worth protecting, no matter how fierce the storm. The days that followed passed like a gentle haze each sunrise, pulling us further from that nightmarish evening in the airport. At dawn, pale light would slip through Isaiah's curtains, painting his room with shifting bands of gold, and I'd watch him breathe softly, the rise and fall of his chest, reminding me that no matter what the world tried to tell him, he belonged here, grounded in love, rooted in possibility. Sometimes I'd stand in the kitchen, the scent of warm cinnamon from his favorite toast drifting into the air, and catch my reflection in the dark window. I'd see a man older than he once was, eyes carrying both the shadows of fear and the glow of a victory hard won. In those moments, I'd whisper to myself that this world wasn't perfect, but every day it offered a chance to make it better, even if only in the quiet moments we share with those we love. In the evenings, Isaiah and I would lie on the porch swing as the sky faded from indigo to velvet black stars kindling one by one. We'd speak softly of airplanes and dreams, our voices weaving together with the cricket song in the tall grass. The memory of that night's injustice still flickered at the edges of our thoughts, but it was softened, now transformed by time and healing. I no longer saw just the pain in Isaiah's eyes. I saw the same boundless wonder that first taught me to look up at the sky. And so we let the silence stretch, let the night hold us in its cool, infinite embrace, and trusted that the sky would always be wide enough for both of us to find our wings. This story shows how easily prejudice can twist a moment of hope into a nightmare, and how courage, truth, and standing up for what's right can turn injustice into lasting change. It reminds us that our dignity doesn't depend on how others see us, but on how we choose to face adversity. It's a call to challenge bias wherever we find it, to speak out when we witness unfairness, and to build a world where every child's dreams are protected, not threatened by the color of their skin or the assumptions of others. Ultimately, it teaches that real power lies not in titles or uniforms, but in integrity, compassion, and the resolve to ensure everyone is treated with respect and fairness.